do you have a year to listen? So what she's referring to is my video about organized religion and spirituality. So I broke away from organized religion and adopted a spiritual lifestyle, and Jessica wants to know what I used to accomplish that. The first thing I did was listen to my intuition. I was raised in a family that was heavily influenced by the holiness religion, and I despised it as early on as 4 or 5 years old. And as I got older, everything in me rejected those ridiculous, fearful beliefs. Nothing about any of it felt right, but I still ignored my intuition, and that resulted in a 30-year ignorant worry and guilt festival. By honoring my intuition, I opened myself up to receive guidance that had desperately been trying to come through for years, and that guidance led me to Dr. Wayne Dyer. I read all of his books. I listened to all of his PBS talks and seminars and educated myself to the max. It didn't take too long for me to see that my entire childhood and socialization process had been based on lies. The more I adopted spiritual practices, the less fearful I became. And for the first time in my life, I felt peaceful and I felt calm. And much of that was attributed to the fact that I was no longer fearful of being thrown into a lake of fire for breaking the 10 Commandments. So, long story short, 2 main factors that played a role in my transition were intuition and education. I looked at the facts instead of the opinions of others for the first time in my life, and the facts backed up what my intuition had been telling me since childhood. I also explored ignorance, particularly my own. So Dr. Dyer taught me that dismissing something you know nothing about is the highest form of ignorance. No one knows for absolute sure what happens to us when we die. Many preachers and affiliates of the church behave very confidently, like they know for sure that sinners will be thrown into a lake of fire if they don't do what is laid out in the Bible. Basic instructions before leaving the earth. Right? Right. So I started seeing this from a different perspective, and one that made more sense to me. And that perspective was, these are some really fearful, outlandish predictions that aren't backed by 1 ounce of evidence. Each denomination contradicts the other and claims that any denomination that believes differently than they do are wrong. Now, if no one knows for absolute sure, that's a pretty ignorant way to live. Coming to that realization was a pivotal moment for me, and that was a realization that was born from primary and secondary research. Again, education saved me. Other materials I used were meditation, and this led me to pray in a new way, a more effective way. Like growing up, I observed certain members of my family, and they didn't pray, they begged. It was like they were in this frantic, crying, strange mourning episode when they would pray, and that gave me the creeps. And not only that, I noticed what a hard life these people had too, but they would say, God is good all the time, and practically in the same damn breath they would say that God would throw me into a lake of fire for eternity if I sinned. And what confused me was, if God was so good to them, then why were they living in poverty? Why were they sick? Why were they bitter, judgmental, and resentful? None of that remotely resembles God or anything good. And they would say that God created all men equal, but either they didn't really believe that or they didn't understand what it meant, because I observed a big old rigid hierarchy, and the men sat on high and looked down low on the women and any other human being that didn't look exactly as they did. That's not God. And these folks are in for a rude awakening. I truly believe that. But back to praying a new way and what I meant by that. So when I started meditating, I started really listening for the first time in my life, and the answers I had always searched for came through with clarity. I stopped begging God to help me, and I started asking God to show me the way. I started saying things like, God, I am open to any divine wisdom and guidance you have for me. I ask that you help me tap into my power and my free will so that I can make the best decisions possible. So speaking that way was a game changer. When we cry and beg God to help us, we are being desperate, and desperation is a low energy vibe that latches onto other things that resemble desperation. And all those years that I cried and begged God to help me and tried to make deals with God, I never received the help I needed. Never. My life was a mess, every piece of it. There was no happiness. But when I started speaking a different language, when I talked to the divine, my life changed drastically. And I learned that I needed to affirm that I already had something instead of begging for it. I also learned that God gave me free will, which placed me in the driver's seat of my life. At that point, I started using my free will to serve me better instead of allowing others to make decisions for me. I also realized that being a good person means that you have a desire to act like God. Now, some people I know would accuse me of blasphemy if they heard me make that comment, act like God. We have opportunities to act like God all day long, and much of that comes from empathy. If you don't have that innate desire to act like God, and that usually involves helping people, there is no church on this planet that can make you want to help people. I have always had a desire to act like God, and I have never been a churchgoer. As a matter of fact, organized religion brings out the worst in me and makes me want to act like the opposite of God. So this realization was significant because I realized that I am God. I was created in likeness of God, so I'm not separate from God. If I was separate, I wouldn't want to better the lives of others. Learning this belief has served me well because it placed the power back into my hands. Organized religion wants to take the power away from the individual, and that's just downright crazy. I guess it's a control tactic. I don't know. I can go on about this forever, but I'll wrap up with this last thing. I started being keenly aware of how people treated me, and I made comparative analyses. After comparing different types of people, I came to the conclusion that it was the organized religion diehards that judged me and criticized me and tried to change me by inflicting fear. And after high school, I was done with bullying. So I guess the church actually did make me see the light after all.